right now, as you're watching this video, the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the history of the Western Hemisphere is collapsing in real time, not slowly, not quietly. We're talking dominoes falling back to back to back, and nobody is putting the full picture together until right now. And I need you to understand, this isn't just a cartel story. This is a story about power, about how an organization gets so embedded in a government that it becomes impossible to separate the two, about what happens when that bond finally breaks, about sons betraying godfathers, about police chiefs filing raid warnings instead of leading raids, about the moment when the whole thing stops working. Let me give you the numbers real quick so you understand the scale of what's going down. 10 current and former Mexican government officials, a governor, a vice attorney general, police chiefs, prosecutors, just got federally indicted in New York City. The head of security for the entire state of Sinaloa, arrested in Arizona on May 11, 2026, and dragged to a federal detention facility in Brooklyn. Not a street soldier, not a low-level operator, the man who commanded the entire state law enforcement apparatus, locked up, done. And El Chapo's sons, the Chapitos, the guys who took over the whole empire after their father got shipped to a supermax in Colorado, they are reportedly negotiating a surrender deal with the U.S. Department of Justice right now. The heirs to the Sinaloa Cartel throne are allegedly about to walk themselves into federal custody and flip on everyone they ever worked with. We're talking about the fall of an empire that has moved more drugs into the United States than any organization in the history of this country. An organization so powerful that it didn't just bribe government officials. It allegedly bought elections, owned police forces, and ran a handwritten payroll of corrupt politicians like it was a small business expense. And all of it is unraveling at the same time. I'm gonna break down every single piece of this for you. How the Sinaloa Cartel was built, how El Chapo's arrest set up the collapse, how El Mayo got kidnapped by his own people and handed to the feds, what that narco payroll actually says about how deep the corruption went, what the Chapitos' surrender deal might actually look like, and what happens to the streets and to Mexico itself when the biggest cartel in the world stops having a head. Stay with me, this one's different. Here's what you need to understand before we get into the timeline. The Sinaloa Cartel was never just a drug organization. For decades, it functioned as a parallel government inside Mexico. It controlled territory and employed hundreds of thousands of people across the supply chain. It corrupted law enforcement, military commanders, prosecutors, judges, and politicians from city mayors all the way up to state governors. In certain parts of Mexico, especially in the state of Sinaloa itself, the cartel wasn't hiding from the government. In many ways, it was the government. At its peak, the Sinaloa Cartel controlled somewhere between 25 and 40% of all illegal drug imports into the United States. Fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin. They had the production infrastructure, the border crossing networks, and the distribution systems that made all of that possible at scale. And the reason they could operate so openly for so long wasn't just firepower. It was relationships, political relationships, business relationships, the kind of relationships you build when you're handing out boxes of cash every month to the right people. That's what made this organization genuinely untouchable for so long. And that's what makes what's happening right now so significant. Because what U.S. prosecutors are dismantling isn't just the cartel, it's the entire protection system that kept the cartel alive. But here's what really went down. When El Mayo Zambada, one of the original co-founders of the Sinaloa Cartel, got kidnapped and handed over to U.S. authorities in the summer of 2024, it didn't just remove one boss, it cracked open the entire machine, and everything that's crawled out since has put some of the most powerful people in Mexican politics directly in the crosshairs of federal prosecutors in New York. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to the beginning. Let's rewind to the 1980s. Back then, Mexico's largest organized crime operation was the Guadalajara Cartel, a massive criminal network that had grown rich off drug trafficking routes that were opening up as U.S. and Colombian authorities cracked down on Caribbean smuggling lanes. But in 1985, everything changed. DEA agent Enrique Camarena was kidnapped, tortured for days, and murdered by Guadalajara cartel operatives. The U.S. response was immediate and overwhelming. The pressure was so intense that by the late 1980s, the Guadalajara cartel had completely fractured into regional factions. One of those factions was based in the state of Sinaloa, and two men, Hector Luis Palma Salazar and Joaquin Guzman Loera, better known to the world as El Chapo, turned their regional faction into the most powerful drug trafficking organization on earth. El Chapo wasn't just a boss with muscle. He was a logistics revolutionary. He pioneered tunnel systems under the US-Mexico border, not just 1 or 2 tunnels, but sophisticated underground corridors with rail systems, ventilation, and electricity. He built relationships with officials at every level of Mexican government. He escaped from 2 maximum security prisons in Mexico before being recaptured. He was extradited to the United States in 2017, stood trial in federal court in Brooklyn in 2018 and 2019, and was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison at ADX Florence in Colorado, one of the most isolated correctional facilities in the world, where he sits today in near total isolation. But here's the thing, El Chapo going to prison didn't kill the Sinaloa Cartel, not even close. It just changed who was running it. 2 power centers stepped up to fill that void. The first was Ismael El Mayo Zambada, El Chapo's longtime partner and co-founder, who has spent decades operating in the shadows while Chapo kept getting arrested. El Mayo was the quiet one, the strategist, the guy who understood that the best way to survive in the drug business was to never be seen. While El Chapo was giving interviews to Sean Penn, El Mayo was invisible. He reportedly never spent a single night in jail for nearly 30 years of co-running one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations. He was 69 years old when he finally got arrested. That's how good he was at staying hidden. Now you have to understand what it actually meant for Los Chapitos to step into that leadership vacuum. El Chapo's sons hadn't just grown up wealthy, they had grown up inside the operation. They knew the routes, they knew the suppliers, they knew who to call and who to avoid. This wasn't a case of kids inheriting a business they didn't understand. They were raised inside it, and when their father went away for life, they didn't hesitate. The second power center was Los Chapitos, El Chapo's sons, specifically 4 brothers, Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, Joaquin, and Ovidio Guzman. They represented the next generation of Sinaloa leadership, younger, more aggressive, more willing to use open violence and flex power publicly. While El Mayo preferred to operate through quiet political arrangements and decades-long relationships, Los Chapitos were the ones ordering open confrontations, running armed convoys and making moves that made international headlines. For a while, this co-leadership arrangement held. El Mayo and Los Chapitos shared the Sinaloa banner, but underneath the surface, the tensions were always there. Different philosophies, different methods, different loyalties. And eventually those tensions didn't just crack, they exploded. Fast forward to 2023, the US government had been quietly building some of the most comprehensive cases in DEA and DOJ history. The Southern District of New York, the same office that prosecuted El Chapo, had been stacking charges for years. And then January 5th, 2023, something happened that showed the world exactly how much power Los Chapitos still had. Mexican government forces moved into Culiacan, the cartel's home base, to arrest Ovidio Guzman, one of Los Chapitos. What happened next was one of the most brazen displays of cartel power in the modern era. Armed convoys flooded the streets. Military-grade weapons came out. Vehicles were set on fire to block roads. The city basically shut down. Mexico's government had actually tried to arrest Ovidio back in 2019 too, but had to let him go because the cartel response was so overwhelming it threatened to collapse the city. This time they held firm. Ovidio was arrested, and within months he was extradited to the United States. Here's where it gets interesting. Because Ovidio's arrival in US custody didn't weaken Los Chapitos, it started a negotiation process. Once Ovidio was in federal custody in Chicago, he had something the US government wanted badly: information, and he started cooperating. Meanwhile, his brother Joaquin, who had been operating more quietly than the others, made what might be the wildest individual play in modern cartel history. In July 2024, Joaquin arranged a meeting with El Mayo Zambada. He told Mayo they were going to fly out and look at some property in Mexico, normal business. Mayo got on the plane, but that plane did not go where El Mayo thought it was going. It landed near El Paso, Texas, and when the doors opened, DEA agents and US law enforcement were already waiting on the tarmac. Joaquin Guzman Lopez had kidnapped his own godfather, a man who had co-founded the cartel alongside his father, who had protected his family for decades. and handed him to the United States government. According to court documents, the US government didn't request or plan the kidnapping, but they knew it was coming because Ovidio had already been cooperating from his Chicago detention facility, and through him, federal agents became aware that Joaquin was planning to move. When that plane touched down in New Mexico, the reception committee wasn't there by coincidence. El Mayo, who had stayed out of U.S. custody for 3 decades, was in handcuffs just like that. At 69 years old, after a lifetime of operating in the shadows, Ismael Zambada Garcia was finally caught. And what happened next inside the Sinaloa Cartel was exactly what you'd expect when a decades-long code gets shattered overnight. The internal war started September 9, 2024. 2 factions, Los Chapitos on one side, La Maíza Zambada loyalists on the other, and the battlefield was Culiacán, Sinaloa's capital city. For nearly 20 months since then, the streets of that city have been a war zone. Hundreds of civilians killed in crossfire, thousands of families displaced, schools closed, businesses abandoned. The Mexican military deployed but couldn't contain it, and we now know part of the reason why. Because law enforcement in Sinaloa was already compromised at the highest levels. Because here's what U.S. prosecutors uncovered while all this was happening on the streets. Los Chapitos hadn't just been running a drug operation. They had allegedly been running a full-scale government corruption operation that went all the way up to the governor's mansion. And it started not with drugs, but with an election. According to a federal indictment unsealed on April 29, 2026 in Manhattan Federal Court, one of the most explosive legal documents to come out of this era, 10 current and former officials from the Sinaloa state government allegedly conspired with Los Chapitos dating all the way back to 2021. And prosecutors claim their arrangement started as an electoral deal. Los Chapitos allegedly provided political support, money, logistics, intimidation to help Ruben Rocha Moya win the Sinaloa governor's race. Once Ruben Moya was in power, the payback began. Each official on the alleged narco payroll had a specific function. Think of it like a corporate org chart, except the company product is fentanyl, and the HR department sends boxes of cash instead of direct deposits. The state police were directed not to arrest Los Chapitos members. Instead, they were instructed to target rival criminal groups, essentially operating as the cartel's enforcement arm against its enemies while protecting its own people. The Vice Attorney General Damaso Castro Saavedra reportedly pulled in around $11,000 a month. His job was to intercept intelligence about DEA operations and Mexican military raids, and pass those warnings directly to the cartel before they happened. Former investigative police chief Marco Antonio Almanza Avalos allegedly received $16,000 a month. What did he do for that money? He allowed vehicles carrying chemical precursors for fentanyl production to move freely through the state. He also used the legal system, court orders, arrest warrants, as a weapon against Los Chapitos' enemies. And at the top of this alleged corruption pyramid was Gerardo Merida Sanchez, the Secretary of Public Security for the state of Sinaloa. His alleged price? $100,000 a month in cash, every single month. For that money, Merida Sanchez was the cartel's most valuable government asset. According to the indictment, he didn't just look the other way. He actively coordinated. In 2023 alone, he allegedly warned Los Chapitos ahead of at least 10 separate planned raids. Raids targeting drug labs, weapons storage sites, and cartel safe houses. Every single time law enforcement was about to move, his call got there first. Personnel scattered, drugs moved, weapons disappeared. By the time agents arrived, the targets were clean. On May 11, 2026, Gerardo Merida Sanchez was arrested in Arizona. He was transferred to New York and appeared before a federal judge in Manhattan on May 15th. He was ordered held at the federal detention facility in Brooklyn, the same facility where El Mayo Zambada is currently awaiting sentencing. No bail. Next court date June 1st. He faces 40 years to life in prison. He is the first of 10 indicted officials to surrender to U.S. authorities. The other 9, including Governor Ruben Rocha Moya himself, remain outstanding. Rocha Moya stepped back from his gubernatorial duties but denied all the charges, calling the indictment a political attack. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum says she wouldn't defend anyone proven to have committed crimes, but pushed hard against the idea of Mexican officials being prosecuted in U.S. courts, saying her country would never subordinate its sovereignty. It's a delicate position. Several of the indicted officials are members of her own ruling Morena party. This has become a diplomatic crisis on top of a criminal one. Before we get into the surrender negotiations, I want to pause and give you the full picture of what the internal cartel war has actually looked like on the ground in Sinaloa. Because it's easy to talk about these things in legal terms, indictments, plea agreements, court dates, and lose sight of what this conflict actually cost the people who live in the middle of it. Since September 9th, 2024, Culiacan has been living through something that most cities in North America can't imagine. Checkpoints set up by armed cartel factions, gunfights erupting in residential neighborhoods, families leaving overnight loading what they can into cars and driving to relatives in other states, local businesses shuttered because workers are too afraid to come in, schools sending kids home because nobody can guarantee their safety on the way there. The Mexican military presence has done what it can, but it's operating in a state where, as the U.S. indictment now makes clear, the law enforcement system itself was compromised. When the people responsible for coordinating security with the military are on the cartel payroll, every operation becomes a potential tip-off. Every raid gets announced before it happens. That's not a military problem. That's a corruption problem that no amount of boots on the ground can fully solve. That's the human reality underneath all these legal proceedings. And it's why what the U.S. prosecutors are doing, exposing and dismantling the corruption infrastructure, not just arresting street-level operators, actually matters for people on the ground in Mexico, not just in American courtrooms. Now let's talk about the Chapitos' surrender situation, because this might be the most consequential part of everything that's happening. Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar and Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar, the two sons of El Chapo who are still free and still running Los Chapitos, are reportedly in active negotiations to turn themselves into the United States government. The Los Angeles Times broke the story citing two sources familiar with the ongoing cases, and according to those sources, these conversations have been going on for approximately a year. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Is this real or is this just rumors? Here's why the evidence suggests something is genuinely moving. First, they hired Jeffrey Lichtman as their defense attorney. That name is significant. Lichtman is the exact same lawyer who represents their half-brothers Ovidio and Joaquin in their U.S. federal cases. He was also El Chapo's defense attorney at trial in 2019. You don't hire the lawyer who was already negotiating deals for your brothers unless you are trying to plug into the same legal framework. Second, on April 6, 2026, a federal judge in Chicago signed an order reassigning the case files for both Ivan Archivaldo and Jesus Alfredo to Judge Sharon Johnson Coleman, the same judge handling Ovidio and Joaquin's cases. When you're consolidating all four brothers' cases under a single judge, that's not random. That's procedural preparation for coordinated proceedings. Third, and this one is something else. On that same April 6th, for several hours, the federal court system stopped listing Ivan Archivaldo and Jesus Alfredo as fugitives in the system, like their status changed as if they were already in custody or in process. 2 days later, the court corrected it and relisted them as fugitives. But the case reassignment stayed. Clerks don't just accidentally stop listing two of the most wanted men in North America as fugitives. According to reporters at InfoBay and other outlets tracking this story closely, Ivan and Jesus Alfredo are watching the sentencing outcomes for their brothers before making a final call. Joaquin Guzman Lopez, the one who handed Mayo to the feds, is scheduled for sentencing on June 1st, 2026. Ovidio's sentencing is set for July 27th. El Mayo himself faces sentencing on July 20th. With life in prison and potential placement at ADX Florence on the table, the brothers want to see those numbers before they walk in. That's the logic. If Joaquin gets a life sentence for cooperating, reports suggest something in the 10-year range, it becomes a much easier decision to make. And what are the alleged deal terms for Ivan and Jesus Alfredo? According to journalists who cover this beat, they could be looking at sentences of 5 to 10 years maximum, not life, not for decades, in exchange for full cooperation with U.S. authorities. On top of that, reportedly, U.S. residency for themselves and their families, and the ability to keep a significant portion of their accumulated wealth. In exchange, they cooperate, they testify, they provide evidence, and the information they carry could be the most detailed picture of cartel government corruption ever to come out of Mexico. They know every official they paid, every election they financed, every judge who signed a favorable order, every raid they were warned about, every ton of fentanyl precursor that moved to a checkpoint because the right person got their monthly cash delivery. Their pilot already went first, which in legal terms is a significant signal. Mauro Alberto Nunez Ojeda, alias El Jondo, Ivan Archivaldo's personal narco pilot, signed a plea agreement with the DOJ on April 9, 2026. He admitted to conspiring to distribute cocaine with intent to import it into the United States. He's facing 10 years to life and up to $10 million in fines. When a personal pilot makes a deal before the boss, that's not coincidence. That's the opening move in a cooperation sequence. Meanwhile, on the street side of this story, the war between Los Chapitos and La Mayiza has ground to a brutal stalemate. Both factions still have enough fighters and resources to keep the conflict going, but neither side can land a decisive blow. 20 months of open warfare has drained both organizations. Personnel lost, territory contested, resources burned. The alliance Los Chapitos built with the Jalisco New Generation Cartel to help offset La Mayiza's pressure took serious hits when CJNG's founder reportedly died and a key intermediary managing the alliance got captured. And on the US enforcement side, the pressure is not letting up. Just this month, Emmanuel Martimiano Leon Soto, a high-ranking Sinaloa Cartel member from Naco, Mexico, was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison in North Carolina for conspiracy to distribute fentanyl, methamphetamine, and cocaine. In Los Angeles County, 4 members of a family in Lancaster were arrested for running a Sinaloa-linked fentanyl and meth distribution ring, sourcing drugs from cartel contacts in Tijuana and Mexicali and smuggling them across in trailers. The DEA is offering $5 million each for 2 brothers, Rene and Alfonso Arzate Garcia, who have run the Sinaloa operation in Tijuana for 15 years. Every layer of the organization is under simultaneous attack. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough when we cover these cartel stories: the scale of what the Sinaloa Cartel actually pumped into the United States in terms of drug volume. We're talking about an organization that, according to DEA estimates and court testimony from multiple prosecutions, was responsible for the majority of fentanyl entering the country during the peak of the overdose crisis. Fentanyl that was manufactured in labs in Sinaloa. Labs that, as the indictment makes clear, were being protected by the state's own head of public security. Every time agents planned to raid one of those labs, Mary de Sanchez's phone call got there first. That means the $100,000 a month he was allegedly being paid wasn't just a corruption cost for Los Chapitos. It was insurance on a production operation worth billions. One phone call warning the cartel ahead of a single raid could protect the lab processing millions of dollars of product. In that context, $100,000 a month is a bargain. And that math tells you exactly why this corruption ran as deep and as long as it did. The return on investment was extraordinary. So what does all of this mean? What actually happens when an organization this large starts to come apart? Here's the honest answer. It doesn't go quietly. Security analysts tracking the Sinaloa situation have laid out a few scenarios for what happens if the Chapitos surrender and the leadership vacuum becomes permanent. The first scenario, and the least likely, is that La Mayiza absorbs Los Chapitos' entire operation and the Sinaloa Cartel reunifies under the Zambada family loyalists. The problem with that scenario is 20 months of war. When you've spent almost 2 years killing each other's soldiers, burning each other's territory, and displacing each other's families, a peace deal isn't just a business decision, it's a betrayal of everyone who died on your side. Most analysts think the level of accumulated violence makes genuine reunification almost impossible. The second scenario, and the more likely one, is fragmentation. Different plaza bosses in different regions start making their own calculations. Some align with La Mayiza, some try to negotiate with CJNG. Some attempt to go fully independent. The unified Sinaloa brand, the organization that operated as a coherent entity across dozens of plazas and international supply chains, breaks into regional pieces that compete and conflict with each other. The third scenario is full dissolution at the top, where the loss of leadership and political protection collapses the international trafficking network entirely, leaving behind smaller regional organizations without the connections or organizational infrastructure to maintain Sinaloa's historic operations. Something similar happened with the Beltran labor cartel when its leadership was taken out. And when those transitions happen, the violence goes up before it goes down, because every faction is suddenly fighting to claim territory that used to be controlled by one unified organization. For the people living in Sinaloa, none of these scenarios mean safety is coming anytime soon. For families in Culiacan and other parts of the state that have been caught in this internal war for the past year and a half, the legal proceedings in New York are very far away. What's real is the roadblock, the shooting down the street, the school that's been closed for weeks, the cousin who works for one side and the neighbor who works for the other. And there's a political dimension to this that is going to continue developing for months. The Morena Party, Mexico's ruling political movement, has multiple members among the indicted officials. That puts President Sheinbaum in an impossible position. She cannot be seen as protecting cartel-connected politicians, but she also cannot be seen as subordinating Mexican sovereignty to U.S. prosecutors. The Trump administration's designation of the Sinaloa Cartel as a foreign terrorist organization gives U.S. prosecutors significantly expanded tools and jurisdiction. How Mexico and the United States navigate this in courts, in diplomatic channels, and in the streets is going to shape the relationship between both countries for the next decade. Let me bring it all the way home. In a matter of weeks in May 2026, here is where we stand. The head of security for the state of Sinaloa is sitting in a Brooklyn federal detention facility. A sitting governor has been indicted in federal court in Manhattan. A handwritten narco payroll has been entered into court evidence detailing monthly bribe payments to over 10 officials, El Chapo's sons. All of them are either in federal custody, cooperating with U.S. prosecutors, or reportedly negotiating their own surrender. El Mayo Zambada is awaiting a life sentence. CJNG's founder is reportedly dead. The cartel's internal civil war is stuck in a bloody stalemate after 20 months. And the political apparatus that protected the Sinaloa Cartel for years inside the Mexican government has been publicly exposed. This is not just a bad month for the Sinaloa Cartel. This is the architecture of their power being dismantled piece by piece. The corruption infrastructure, the political relationships, the legal protection, the family leadership, all of it coming apart at the same time. And think about the political domino effect that's still playing out. The U.S. indicting a sitting Mexican governor is unprecedented. The U.S. designating the Sinaloa Cartel as a foreign terrorist organization gives prosecutors tools that go well beyond traditional drug trafficking charges. It means anyone who provides material support to the organization, financially, logistically, politically, can potentially be charged under anti-terrorism statutes. That's a much wider net. And with the Chapitos potentially cooperating, that net could catch people we haven't even heard mentioned yet. The Sinaloa Cartel built its empire over 40 years. It survived the arrests of El Chapo, it survived the Zeta Wars, it survived internal conflicts that would have destroyed smaller organizations. It survived because it had something most criminal organizations never achieved: deep, structural roots inside legitimate power. And now, for the first time in its history, those roots are being pulled up. That's the fall of an empire, and we are watching it happen in real time. One more thing I want you to sit with. We talk about these organizations in terms of bosses and lieutenants and plaza commanders, but the Sinaloa Cartel at its peak wasn't just a top-down hierarchy. It was a franchise model. The leadership provided protection, supply chains, and political cover. Individual operators in different cities and states ran their own businesses under that umbrella. When that umbrella gets pulled away, when the political protection evaporates, when the supply chain gets disrupted, when the leadership is either in prison or negotiating plea deals, those individual operators don't automatically stop operating. Some of them try to keep going on their own. Some of them look for a new umbrella. Some of them start fighting the people who used to be their colleagues. That fragmentation is already happening inside Sinaloa right now, and it's what makes the transition period so dangerous. The fall of a cartel isn't a single moment, it's a process, sometimes a long one. And in that process, the violence doesn't stop. It often gets worse before it gets better, because the rules that used to govern the conflict, who's protected, who's off limits, what lines you don't cross, disappear along with the organization that enforced them. That's the reality that people in Sinaloa are living through right now. And it's the reality that communities in the United States that were downstream of Sinaloa's drug supply are going to be navigating for years to come as the trafficking landscape shifts and reorganizes. If you made it this far, you already know the story isn't over. Drop a comment. Do you think Ivan Archivaldo actually surrenders? Does the cartel survive the fragmentation, or does it dissolve completely? And as this develops, we're going to keep breaking it down. I'll see you in the next one.